I, 32F, have a younger brother George, 28M, who just got married last week. Instead of celebrating his new marriage, he's been calling me nonstop, blaming me for Dad not showing up at his wedding. The whole situation is messy and has a lot of history behind it, so I'll try to explain everything. Our parents split up when I was 15 and George was 11. Dad was a heavy drinker, and it started even before I can remember. Mom used to tell me that when I was a baby, she'd often find empty bottles hidden in the garage. By the time I was in elementary school, Dad would come home drunk at least 3 times a week. He wasn't physically violent, but the emotional abuse was constant and devastating. Dad worked as a sales manager at a car dealership, and he'd often use work stress as an excuse for his drinking. He'd come home reeking of alcohol, slam doors, and start screaming at Mom about the smallest things, dinner being cold, the house not being clean enough, or even us kids making too much noise while playing. He'd call her worthless, blame her for everything wrong in his life, and sometimes lock himself in their bedroom for days, refusing to talk to any of us. I remember one particularly bad night when I was 14. Mom had been working as a bank teller for years, taking whatever shifts she could get while still being there for us kids. She finally got promoted to branch manager, which meant better hours and significantly better pay. Instead of being happy for her, Dad couldn't handle that she was making more money than him. He came home completely wasted the night of her celebration dinner. Mom had bought a special cake and invited her parents and sister over. Dad showed up 2 hours late, threw the cake against the wall in front of everyone, and told Mom she was trying to emasculate him. My grandparents left immediately, and I had to clean up the mess while Mom cried in the bathroom. George was young and didn't fully understand what was happening, but I saw everything. The incidents kept piling up. Dad would miss work because of hangovers, forcing Mom to cover our bills with her salary. He'd spend our grocery money on alcohol, making Mom ask her sister for help feeding us. He'd forget to pick George up from school, leaving him waiting for hours until I could get there after my own classes. What made it worse was how he'd act the next day, like nothing had happened. He'd wake up, go to work, if he wasn't too hungover, and act completely normal. If Mom tried to talk about his behavior, he'd either deny everything or blame it on work stress. The final straw came when Mom found out Dad had emptied their joint savings account, almost $15,000 they'd saved for our college funds. He'd gone on a 3-day drinking binge with his friends in Vegas, lost most of it gambling, and couldn't even remember where the rest went. Mom finally had enough. She filed for divorce and got full custody of us, though Dad got visitation rights. Surprisingly, after the divorce, Dad got his act together. He started attending AA meetings, got a better job at a different dealership, and even started dating again. 3 years after the divorce, he met Sarah at work. She was the dealership's accountant. They dated for a year before getting married. Sarah seemed nice enough, and Dad appeared happier with her. He stopped drinking completely and became more reliable with his visitation schedule and child support payments. George was absolutely thrilled about Dad's transformation. He spent every weekend at Dad and Sarah's place, while I kept my distance. I just couldn't forget the years of trauma Dad put us through. I saw him at major holidays and occasionally at George's events, but I never got close to him again. Mom also moved on and found happiness with David, who she met through a mutual friend. They dated for 3 years before getting married 5 years ago. Now to the current situation. When George got engaged to his girlfriend Emma, 27F, last year, he started making weird demands about the wedding. First, he insisted that Dad should walk him down the aisle along with Mom. Mom agreed, wanting to keep the peace even though I could tell she was uncomfortable. Then George dropped the bomb. He wanted Mom to come alone, without David. His excuse was that he wanted a family-only ceremony, which made absolutely no sense since Dad was bringing Sarah. I tried talking to George about how unfair this was. David had been in our lives for 7 years, helped put George through college, and had always treated us like his own kids. But George wouldn't listen. He kept saying that Dad had changed and deserved a second chance. He even suggested that Mom and Dad might reconnect at the wedding if David wasn't there. I told him he was being delusional and disrespectful to both Mom and David. The situation got even worse when George started spreading lies to Emma's family. He told them David wasn't invited because he had caused problems in our family and made it difficult for Dad to be involved in our lives. This was completely false. David had always encouraged us to maintain a relationship with Dad and had never said a negative word about him. When I confronted George about these lies, he said he needed to protect Dad's image in front of his in-laws and make sure they didn't think badly of him. Mom, being the amazing person she is, eventually decided to attend without David just to keep the peace. She didn't want to risk ruining George's big day. But then Dad didn't show up at all. He sent a text to George an hour before the ceremony saying he couldn't make it. No explanation, no apology, just that he wasn't coming. George was devastated and immediately called me, convinced I must have said something to Dad to make him skip the wedding. The truth is, I hadn't spoken to Dad in months. The last time we talked was at George's engagement party, and it was just basic small talk. I had no idea why he didn't come. But George wouldn't believe me. He's been telling everyone that I sabotaged his wedding because I couldn't let go of the past. Now Emma's family is asking questions about why both Dad and David were absent, and George expects me to lie and say there was a medical emergency. I refuse to cover for him or make up excuses. I'm tired of the lies and the pretense. Now George is panicking because Emma's parents are starting to piece together the real story, and he's worried they'll judge him for how he treated Mom and David. He keeps calling me, saying I'm ruining his marriage before it even starts by not backing up his story. Ida for refusing to lie to his in-laws? Update 1, it's been 2 weeks since my last post, and things have gotten even more complicated than I imagined. Sarah, Dad's wife, reached out to me yesterday, which was surprising since we rarely talk. She wanted to meet in person, so we had coffee this morning. What she revealed about why Dad didn't show up at the wedding left me completely shocked. According to Sarah, George had been pressuring Dad for months before the wedding to pretend he was still in love with Mom during the ceremony. It wasn't just about walking down the aisle together, George had planned an entire performance. He wanted Dad to dance with Mom for every slow song, give a speech about their beautiful family, and take dozens of family photos without Sarah or David. Sarah found out about this when she accidentally saw the detailed schedule George had sent to Dad, which specifically excluded her from most of the wedding activities. What bothers me most is that Dad initially agreed to go along with this charade. Sarah said he didn't want to disappoint George and thought he could handle pretending for one day. But 3 days before the wedding, George sent Dad a script for his father of the groom's speech. Sarah showed me the email on her phone, and I couldn't believe what I was reading. George had written lines like I never stopped loving their mother and she was the one that got away. He wanted Dad to say that divorcing Mom was the biggest mistake of his life and that he thinks about her every day. The speech also included bizarre suggestions about how Dad should look at Mom during the ceremony. Apparently, George wanted him to gaze longingly at her during specific moments. He even included a note about how Dad should accidentally call Sarah by Mom's name during the reception to show he was still confused about his feelings. The whole thing read like a bad romance novel. But that's not even the craziest part. Sarah revealed that George had been telling Emma's entire family a completely different version of our family history. He'd been introducing Sarah at pre-wedding events as Dad's current girlfriend or temporary partner, deliberately hiding the fact that they'd been married for 9 years. He told Emma's parents that our parents' divorce was just a temporary separation and that everyone knew they would eventually get back together. George had created this elaborate fantasy where Dad was just waiting for the right moment to leave Sarah and reunite with Mom. He told Emma's family that Sarah was aware of this arrangement and was just helping Dad pass the time until he could be with his true love again. Sarah found out about these lies when Emma's aunt approached her at the rehearsal dinner, expressing sympathy about her difficult position in our family. When Sarah confronted George about these stories, he didn't even seem to think he'd done anything wrong. Instead, he broke down and revealed something that explains his bizarre behavior. He'd been seeing a fortune teller. Not just occasionally, but 3 times a week for the past year. This woman, who calls herself Madame Elena, had convinced George that our parents were celestial soulmates who had been torn apart by dark forces. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother, who has a business degree and works as a financial analyst, had been basing major life decisions on a fortune teller's advice. Sarah showed me the bank statements she found in Dad's office. George had spent over $15,000 on readings and spiritual guidance about reuniting our parents. He'd been paying this woman $200 per session to feed him stories about how second marriages never last and how children of divorce have a sacred duty to fight for their family's true destiny. This Madame Elena had apparently told George that if he could get our parents to dance together at his wedding while a specific song played, their first dance song from their wedding, it would break the curse on their marriage. She claimed that the moment they touched, all the negative energy from their past would dissolve, and they would realize they were meant to be together. George had planned his entire wedding around this supposed prophecy. The truth about Dad not showing up was tied to all of this. The night before the wedding, George sent Dad one final email. Sarah showed it to me. It was practically unhinged. George had written that if Dad didn't follow the script exactly, if he showed any affection toward Sarah or acknowledged her as his wife, he would be destroying the family's last chance at happiness. He told Dad that this wedding was destined to be the moment our family healed, and if Dad ruined it, George would never forgive him. That's when Dad finally broke. He couldn't handle the pressure of George's demands or the responsibility of supposedly fixing our family through this elaborate deception. Rather than go through with George's plan or confront him about how delusional it all was, Dad took the coward's way out and just didn't show up. Sarah decided to tell me all of this because she's worried about George. She thinks he's having some kind of breakdown and needs help. She feels guilty for not telling us sooner about George's odd behavior and the fortune teller's influence. She'd also wanted me to know that she never meant to come between our parents, something George had apparently accused her of repeatedly. I'm still trying to process all of this information. It explains so much about George's recent behavior, but it also raises new concerns about his mental state. I haven't told Mom any of this yet. I know I should, but I'm worried about how she'll react to learning that her son has been essentially plotting to break up her marriage based on a fortune teller's predictions. I tried calling George after my meeting with Sarah, but he won't answer my calls. Emma texted me saying he's not ready to talk. I don't even know how to begin addressing this situation. My brother needs help, but I'm not sure he's willing to admit that anything's wrong. Update 2. 3 months have passed since my last update, and the situation has taken an even more twisted turn. After learning about the fortune teller's influence on George, Mom decided to do some digging. What she uncovered was shocking. Madame Elena wasn't just some random fortune teller taking advantage of my brother's vulnerability. She was Lisa Martinez, Sarah's former sister-in-law from her first marriage. The story goes deeper than we imagined. Before Sarah met our dad, she was married to Lisa's brother, James. Their marriage ended when James died in a car accident 12 years ago. According to what Mom found out, there was a significant inheritance involved. James had a successful construction business, and in his will, he left 60% of his assets to Sarah and 40% to his family. Lisa was furious about this split, claiming Sarah had manipulated James into changing his will just months before his death. Sarah had used her portion of the inheritance to start a new life, which eventually led her to meeting our dad at the dealership. All these years, Lisa had been harboring resentment, believing Sarah had stolen what she saw as her family's rightful inheritance. When she discovered through social media that Sarah had married our dad and become a stepmother, she saw an opportunity for revenge. Lisa specifically targeted George after learning he was Sarah's stepson. She set up her fortune-telling business in our city just 6 blocks from George's office, knowing he would pass by it every day on his way to work. She even hired people to casually mention to George how accurate her readings were. It was all an elaborate scheme to get close to him and use him to destroy Sarah's new life. She knew from stalking George's social media that he was struggling with accepting our parents' divorce even after all these years. She played on this vulnerability, feeding him exactly what he wanted to hear, that our parents were meant to be together, that Sarah was just a temporary obstacle, and that he had the power to fix our family. The worst part is how methodically she manipulated him. Mom found online reviews where Lisa's other clients complained about her charging $50 to $75 per session. But she charged George $200, knowing he made good money as a financial analyst. She used that extra money to hire private investigators to dig up details about our family's past, information she would then casually drop during readings to make her predictions seem more credible. When Sarah discovered this connection, she was horrified. She remembered Lisa from family gatherings during her first marriage but hadn't recognized her as Madame Elena because Lisa had dramatically changed her appearance. She and Dad immediately reached out to George to explain everything. They showed him photos of Lisa from Sarah's first wedding, proving she was the same person as Madame Elena. George was devastated. Finding out that the person he had trusted with his deepest hopes about our family was actually someone with a vendetta against Sarah broke something in him. He finally realized how his actions had hurt everyone, especially Mom and David. The reality that he'd spent thousands of dollars funding someone's revenge scheme against his own stepmother hit him hard. The truth about Lisa came out to Emma's family too. Emma's father, who works as a lawyer, was particularly angry about the manipulation. He's helping George build a case against Lisa for fraud, though George is hesitant about pursuing legal action because he's embarrassed about being so thoroughly deceived. Emma has been surprisingly supportive through all this, but she's made it clear to George that things need to change. She insisted that he start setting firm boundaries with Dad and Sarah's extended family. She also helped him see how his obsession with reuniting our parents had affected their own relationship. Apparently, he had been comparing every aspect of their relationship to our parents' marriage, trying to avoid what he saw as their mistakes. Mom suggested family counseling, but George isn't ready for that yet. He's still processing the humiliation of falling for Lisa's scheme and the guilt over how he treated everyone. He did, however, finally call David to apologize for excluding him from the wedding. It was a start, even if it came too late to fix the hurt he caused. The most ironic part of all this is that Lisa's plan to destroy Sarah's happiness completely backfired. Instead of breaking up Sarah and Dad's marriage, this whole situation has actually brought them closer together. Sarah's handling of the situation, choosing to tell me the truth, helping uncover Lisa's deception, and still showing concern for George despite how he treated her, has shown everyone what a genuinely good person she is. I'm still angry at Lisa for taking advantage of my brother's emotional vulnerability, but I'm also relieved that the truth came out before more damage could be done to our family. Update 3. It's been 6 months since everything happened, and our family has gone through significant changes. After the truth about Lisa came out, George finally apologized to Mom and David for excluding David from the wedding. It wasn't an easy conversation. George broke down several times while trying to explain his actions. He admitted that even before meeting Lisa, he'd struggled with accepting Mom's marriage to David, but Lisa's manipulation had turned that struggle into an unhealthy obsession. David, being the incredible person he is, didn't hold on to any resentment. He told George that while the wedding exclusion hurt him deeply, he understood that George had been manipulated during a vulnerable time in his life. Mom was more hesitant to forgive so quickly, not because of the wedding itself, but because of how George had been painting her as a bad mother to Emma's family. It took several long conversations for them to reach a better place. The situation with Lisa took an unexpected turn. Even though George didn't want to pursue legal action, Emma's father discovered that Lisa had been running her fortune-telling business without proper licenses and had several complaints filed against her for fraud. He reported his findings to the authorities, and Lisa is now facing criminal charges for running a fraudulent business. She's also being investigated for stalking, as evidence showed she had been following both George and Sarah for months before setting up her business near George's office. Dad and Sarah moved to Arizona for work 3 months ago. Initially, I was worried this might trigger George's abandonment issues again, but surprisingly, the distance has been healthy for everyone. Without the pressure of forced family gatherings and fake reunions, we've all been able to build more genuine relationships. George and Dad talk on the phone once a week, but there's no more fantasy about him leaving Sarah or getting back with Mom. Emma's family has been incredibly understanding through all of this. Emma's mother actually shared that she had gone through something similar with her own divorced parents, which helped her understand George's behavior better. They've been helping George realize that a healthy family isn't about forcing people together or living in the past, but about accepting reality and building honest relationships in the present. Mom and David recently renewed their vows in a small garden ceremony for their 5th anniversary. This time, George not only attended with Emma but also gave a heartfelt speech about how David had been more of a father figure to him than he'd previously allowed himself to admit. It was a beautiful moment of healing for everyone. Sarah reached out to me last week to share that she's expecting a baby. She was nervous about telling George, worried it might upset him, but he took the news well. He even offered to help set up the nursery when they visit for Christmas. It's a small gesture, but it shows how far he's come in accepting that Dad has a separate life and family now. The most significant change I've noticed is in George himself. He stopped idealizing our childhood and our parents' marriage. He started talking about some of the darker memories he had suppressed, the fights he pretended not to hear, the times Dad missed his school events because he was drunk, the way Mom used to cry when she thought we were asleep. It's painful, but it's real, and dealing with these memories honestly seems to be helping him move forward. Emma tells me he's also become more invested in their relationship instead of constantly comparing it to our parents' marriage. They're talking about starting their own family soon, and George seems determined to break the cycle of dysfunction he was so desperately trying to recreate just 6 months ago. While our family isn't perfect, we're finally learning to accept each other as we are, not as we wish we could be. Sometimes broken things can't be fixed, but maybe they can be rebuilt into something different, and possibly even better.